Hey there, Alex Kidman here, and once again, it's the middle of the night and I'm messing around with phone cameras. Rather specifically, the Samsung Galaxy S23 Ultra, which Samsung has loaned me for a couple of weeks to review. I thought I'd give it a little bit of shootout practice against the iPhone 14 Pro and the Google Pixel 7 Pro. Now, a couple of notes before I get started and before I throw to the photos that I've taken. Pretty much everything is being taken freehand and in auto mode. Now, I know, yes, I could get slightly different results. In fact, in some cases, massively different results simply by shooting in RAW and doing lots of post-processing. But let's face it, a lot of people just aren't going to do that. In every case except one, I'm going to be just shooting freehand and as close as I can. Any cropping differences are probably the cameras themselves. I am hoping to do a little astrophotography with a tripod, so that won't be freehand, but that depends. And basically, I'm in Sydney. There's a lot of light pollution. I'm not expecting great photos. And speaking of great photos, I'm not going for spectacular compositions here. I'm really trying to look at how well each of these phones picks up light in challenging situations. It's not totally pitch black here right now. It'll get a bit worse as I go on, but it's definitely low light. It's definitely that area that you would expect a flagship phone to do really well in. Anyway, with that preamble out of the way, I'm going to remind you to subscribe, and then I'm going to get on with the show. So don't forget to subscribe. So first up, a little cheap solar light that's actually in my front garden, just to get an idea of how they'd handle a bright light source. Now, how I'm going to do this, because YouTube is going to compress these, and they're not necessarily going to look their best, is I'm going to rank them from worst to best, based on my own observations of the shot. Honestly, with this shot, it's super, super close, but I'm going to say that the least impressive, and they're all pretty good for this shot, would be the iPhone 14 Pro, but it really is very, very close. Google does just a tiny little bit better with the details, but not by much. Again, these are all pretty pleasing shots. Which, of course, means that the S23 Ultra takes the prize for this shot, but you're not going to be unhappy with any of them, honestly. It's super, super close at this juncture. Over the years, I've used this shot of this park a lot for low light comparisons. And again, it's super, super close. And what's really interesting here is how each of these phones interprets both the sky and the grass beneath. Here, I like what Google does with the sky, but the grass is a little washed out. The S23 Ultra does a brighter grass. It's a bit more like the grass's natural colour, but a little bit more of a washed out sky. It's still quite a nice shot though. None of these are bad shots to speak of, and it is still quite dark, so the light pickup is quite impressive. Which of course means that the iPhone 14 Pro takes it. Nice grass, nice sky. And just to deal with this up front, if anyone's thinking, hang on, why aren't you shooting with the 14 Pro Max? Well, they're the same camera, and the 14 Pro is a lot easier to hold in the hand. I actually prefer it as a camera system. Your preferences can vary. Moving on to another shot, a silhouette of some trees. And here the 14 Pro delivered a reasonable kind of photo. It's not an unpleasant shot, but it got a lot less detail out of the grass. That bright thing you can see, by the way, is the moon. We'll get back to that shortly. The Pixel 7 Pro does this one a little better. You get a bit more detail in that ground, in the grass and the mud and so on. Even a little bit more detail in the trees too. But there's still one that's just a little bit better. And that is, of course, the S23 Ultra, which just grabs a bit more colour to that grass. You get a little bit more definition down there. The trees are perhaps not quite so sharp, but overall, I think the S23 Ultra takes us. And it's looking good for this phone. The margins are small. They're all good camera phones, but the S23 Ultra is winning more than it's losing. So I then turned just a little bit to my right into a clump of trees with something in front of it. And honestly, in the amount of light I had, I could not tell with the naked eye what it was. It's a little power relay station or something along those lines. I'm not an electrician. You can correct me in the comments below. Google did the least impressive shot here, I think. The S23 Ultra punches that shot up a lot. You get a lot more detail there, although you also get a little bit of kind of artificial looking colour. Not a terrible shot, and as I said, I couldn't see what this was with the naked eye anyway in the amount of light that I had. So it's still showing off some decent light chops, but its post-processing is also rather more evident. Which leaves the iPhone 14 Pro delivering the most balanced shot, not the most colourful or brightest, but the clearest, I think, given the conditions. Turning around to the clubhouse, which was now behind me, I wanted to get a shot of this because it was lit up and I wanted to see how these phones dealt with those bright light sources. The Pixel 7 Pro did the worst of this, especially on the upper level of that clubhouse. It's really very blown out. There's not a lot of detail that you can make out in this shot. The iPhone 14 Pro does a little better here, a bit more detail in that clubhouse. Interesting again to see how the sky is interpreted by both of these phones as well. The S23 Ultra, though, for the clubhouse detail, really does take it. You can make out a lot more of that detail, although, of course, it picked up slightly less colour on the grass. Still, I'm giving it for this one simply because it didn't blow out those lights quite so badly as the other two phones. And now astrophotography time. And as a reminder, I'm shooting this with a tripod, and I'm shooting it in Sydney. Lots of light pollution. Wasn't expecting much, and let's face it, I didn't get much. The S23 Ultra, though, was, sadly for it, easily the worst of the performers in this field. Was that a field pun? Well, yeah, it was. Blame me. The iPhone 14 Pro did a little bit better than the Samsung, but not by much. It's still not a particularly stellar shot. And this is where the Pixel 7 Pro picks up its first win, because it delivered, under the circumstances, which are pretty awful, a pretty decent looking shot. It's easily above the other two phones in this respect alone. Now, that bright thing we saw earlier was the moon. The moon was out and the moon was bright, which obviously would have affected my photos and my astrophotography a little as well. But I also wanted to see how well each of these phones could take photos of the moon at maximum zoom. Now, I know that's a digital crop, but they're meant to post-process for this. They're meant to provide a reasonable-looking shot. And, of course, the S23 Ultra has a couple of tricks up its sleeve there. The iPhone did the worst at this. This is not a great shot at all. It maxes out at 15 times zoom, and it didn't deliver a pleasing photo of the moon at all. The Pixel 7 Pro, of course, can get closer. It does up to 30 times zoom. And I've actually had some impressive results in normal daylight with its 30 times digital zoom. This shot of the moon, though, is not one of them. It's not a great photo at all. It's not really anything you'd want to put on your Instagram, let's face it. So what about the S23 Ultra? Well, because it has space zoom, yes, you do have to say it that way, I wanted to play around with some of its zoom ranges to see what it could do. Here's the 10 times zoom shot. Little bit under, of course, the maximum of the iPhone 14 Pro, but actually not a terribly unpleasant, if slightly blown out, shot. And here's 30 times zoom, so that's the same as the maximum that Pixel 7 Pro can do, but man, the difference there is pretty intense. Now, I promise you, these are all on the same tripod, pointing in the same direction. They're all on the same night, in the same field. It's all the same thing, and the S23 is just blowing me away. But what if I push it to that maximum 100 times space zoom? You get this shot. Now, is that perfect? No. I'm working off a cheap tripod, which is set up in the middle of a muddy field, in the middle of the night in Sydney. And look, it took me a little bit of time to actually get the 100 times to, point in quite the right direction, because obviously tiny movements at 100 times zoom equal huge skews of where you center your frame from. So I did have to work to get this shot. But the reality is, in a comparative sense, against that Pixel 7 Pro, against that 14 Pro iPhone, yeah, they just can't even approach this kind of thing. 100 times space zoom, generally speaking, in my experience, has never really been massively worth using, but this might be the one area where it just about could. So what does all of this mean for the S23 Ultra? Well, look, it either won or came second in nearly every test I did there. So I reckon Samsung's got a really powerful camera system on its hands. Bear in mind, we won't see a new iPhone till much later in the year, and probably won't see a new Pixel till around the same time frame or later. And that could mark the S23 Ultra out as a real camera pro phone. Now, I've still got to do a whole bunch of testing before I finish off my full review, but that will be coming real soon. So stay tuned and please do subscribe, and thanks for watching through to the end.